Drop it now! I said drop the weapon! Stop right there! Get on the ground!
Get in the car now! Stop resisting!
No! Did you just see that? What is happening?
You think you can talk to me that way?
The city of Ashford woke slowly on Saturday mornings. Along Delancey Street, in the South Side District, the shutters were still down. The only sound was the hiss of a street sweeper 2 blocks over. Julian Reeves liked it this way. At 54, he had spent 30 years learning a simple truth. The truth is easiest to see when nobody is performing for you. He parked his 12-year-old Buick outside Hollis Hardware and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there with his coffee, watching the light come up gray over the rooftops. He was not, this morning, the Inspector General of the Ashford Police Department. He was just Julian, a man in a faded canvas jacket and worn work boots, come to buy a fitting for a leaking pipe under his kitchen sink. The sink was his wife's, really. Delia had complained about that slow drip for 2 years before the cancer took her. Julian had kept meaning to fix it. The way you keep meaning to do the small things you promised the people you loved. This morning, he finally had the part number written on the back of his hand. Later, he would pick up his granddaughter, Zora, and pretend to lose at checkers until she laughed. That was the whole plan for the day. A pipe fitting, a little girl, a quiet Saturday. He'd chosen this shop, in this neighborhood, without quite letting himself say why. The South Side had been sitting on his mind lately, a low hum he couldn't turn off. He had learned over 30 years to trust that hum. He didn't examine it this morning. He just drank his coffee and watched the light come up. He had no idea the air was about to fill with the smell of his own blood. 200 feet down the block, a patrol cruiser eased off its brakes. Behind the wheel sat Sergeant Kyle Brennan. Brennan was a man whose uniform was always pressed a little too sharp, as if the crease could hold together something that was coming apart underneath. At 38, he had 11 years on the force and 5 civilian complaints. Every one of them had been quietly filed away by a captain who owed his career to Brennan's godfather. This morning, Brennan was bored. Bored and looking for something to make him feel large. And down the block, he saw an older black man in a beat-up jacket climbing out of an old car outside a shop that wasn't open yet. Brennan didn't see a homeowner. He saw a story he could tell. It was the last story he would ever get to tell on his own terms. He rolled the cruiser up hard, angling it to block the Buick, and stepped out without calling it in. That detail would matter later. He never radioed the storm. He simply appeared, like weather. "Morning," Brennan said, in the flat, sarcastic tone of a man who had already decided how this would end. "That your vehicle?" Reeves turned, unhurried, and set his coffee on the roof of the car. "It is," he said. His voice was low and even. "Something wrong, officer?" "Sergeant," Brennan corrected, stepping closer. "We've had a string of break-ins on this block. Older sedans, guy matching your description." There was no such string. There was no such description. There was only a man who wanted to watch another man flinch. "ID, registration, let's go." "Of course," Reeves said. He moved slowly, deliberately, narrating each motion the way a lifetime of watching bad stops had taught him. "My wallet is in my left jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for it now with my left hand." He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply complied. And that calm was the first thing that made Brennan angry, because Brennan wanted fear. He got composure instead. Reeves held out his license. Brennan glanced at it for half a second and handed it right back without reading it. He wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in the story. "Whose car did you say this was again?" "Mine," Reeves said quietly. "Registration's in the glove box. I'll need to open the door to get it." "A guy like you," Brennan said, letting the words hang in the cold air, "doesn't drive a car like this." It was meant to sting. It was meant to be remembered. And it would be. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." "My hands are visible," Reeves answered. "I've done nothing wrong. I'd like your name and badge number." That request snapped something in Brennan. It was a polite, procedural request, the exact request Reeves's own office told citizens to make. But Brennan didn't hear aright. He heard defiance. "Turn around." "Officer, I've done nothing." "Turn around. Hands behind your back. Now." "You're making a... now." He grabbed Reeves by the arm and wrenched it hard behind his back. "You're being detained. Resisting." "I am not resisting." Reeves's voice stayed level. "But you're making a mistake, a bad one. Think carefully." Brennan didn't think. He shoved. Reeves was slammed forward against the hood of his own Buick, the metal cold against his cheek. His coffee cup toppled and burst on the pavement. Brennan yanked both wrists together and ratcheted the cuffs down until they bit into skin. A thin line of blood opened where Reeves's lip met the edge of the hood. 54 years old, 30 of them in service to this city. And he was bent over a car at dawn for the crime of asking a man his name. He did not cry out. He did not beg. He turned his head just enough to speak, and his voice, even then, was terrifyingly calm. "You are going to remember this moment," he said, "for the rest of your life." Brennan laughed. "Nobody's coming for you, old man. You're nobody." He was about to learn how wrong a single sentence could be. A few feet away, a young officer stood frozen by the cruiser. His name was Danny Vega. He was 24, 8 months on the job, and he had drawn Brennan as a training officer the way a man draws a bad card. Vega had watched the whole thing. He had seen the license. He had heard the man narrate every movement. He had watched Brennan invent a crime out of clear morning air, and his hand, without him quite deciding it, had drifted to his body camera and switched it on the instant Brennan grabbed the man's arm. "Sarge," Vega said, his voice thin. "Sarge, he showed us his ID. He wasn't—" "You didn't see anything," Brennan said, not even turning around. "You want a career in this city? You saw a man resist arrest. That's the whole story. Now cuff check him and load him up." Vega's hands shook as he opened the back door of the cruiser, but his camera stayed on. And so did the phone of a woman named Renata Ortiz, who had come out onto her second-floor balcony to water her plants and had started filming the second she saw an old man's face pressed to a car hood. 2 lenses, 2 records. Brennan didn't notice either of them. He never did. That was always his mistake. At the 8th Precinct, Julian Reeves said nothing. They booked him as a John Doe because Brennan deliberately typed the wrong middle initial and let the name fail to come back clean. They took his boots and his jacket. They put him in a holding cell with a drunk man asleep on the bench, and they left him there. And through all of it, Reeves sat with his cuffed hands in his lap, his back straight, his eyes forward, saying absolutely nothing. He was not in shock. He was doing what he had trained a whole generation of investigators to do. He was letting them build the case for him. Every falsified field on that booking sheet was evidence. Every hour he sat uncharged in a cage was evidence. Every camera in that building they didn't know was still running was evidence. It was all accumulating, quietly, in his favor. A lesser man would have shouted his title the moment the cuffs went on. Reeves understood something that men like Brennan never would. The deepest holes are the ones people dig for themselves, so he let them dig. Once, a desk officer walked past the cell, paused, and squinted at him through the bars. Something about the face. A flicker of recognition, there and then gone. Reeves held his gaze evenly and said nothing at all. The officer frowned, shook his head, and moved on, telling himself he was tired and seeing things. The Inspector General of the Ashford Police Department does not sit in a South Side holding cell in a canvas jacket with a split lip and a John Doe tag. It was, the officer decided, impossible. He walked back to his desk and did not mention it to anyone. He would remember being wrong about that for a very long time. Everyone in that building would. Reeves noticed the near recognition, filed it away, and let it pass. He was counting things. The minutes he'd been held without a charge. The number of officers who walked past a bleeding man and did nothing. The exact moment the booking clock started, and the exact lie on the sheet that started it. He was, even bleeding, even caged, doing the only thing he had ever really done. He was building a record. And a record, in the right hands, is heavier than any badge. And the record was already growing without him. Out in the parking lot, Officer Danny Vega sat in his cruiser with shaking hands and did the one thing a smarter coward never would. He uploaded his body camera footage to the department cloud, 200 feet of it, time-stamped, copied to 3 places, before anyone could think to ask him to lose it. What Brennan didn't know, boots up on a chair in the break room, was that the evidence that would bury him had already left the building. And it wasn't the only crack. At the records desk, a young clerk named Priya Anand ran the John Doe's prints out of pure routine and stopped. They didn't come back empty. They came back sealed, locked behind a state-level clearance she had never once seen on a South Side booking. She didn't understand it, but careful people leave notes, and Priya was careful. She flagged the file and wrote down the time, a small thing. It would matter more than she could imagine. 2 hours passed. Brennan, meanwhile, was in the break room. He had his boots up on a chair and a cup of bad coffee in his hand, and he was telling 2 other officers about the mouthy old man who thought he could ask a sergeant for a badge number. Some people, he said, grinning, you have to teach them where they are. The others laughed, because laughing was easier than not. Brennan felt large. He felt, in that moment, like the biggest man in the building. He had never been smaller in his life. He just didn't know it yet. Priya Anand's flag did not sit quietly for long. Within the hour, it reached the watch lieutenant, a cautious man named Ellis Park. Park tried to clear the sealed record himself and couldn't. You do not get a state-level clearance seal on a man booked for resisting arrest outside a hardware store. It made no sense. And Park had survived 20 years by knowing that things which make no sense, left alone, become your problem. His stomach tightened. He didn't understand what he was looking at. He only knew it was wrong. So he did what cautious men do with a problem too big to hold. He pushed it up the ladder. He called the captain in on his day off. Then the door to the booking area opened, and Captain Roy Doyle walked in. Doyle was already annoyed, already rehearsing how he'd smooth over whatever Brennan had done this time. He hadn't been told about the sealed prints, only that there was a situation with a booking. The kind of vague phrase that had never once, in 26 years, turned out to be good news. He was a heavy-set man with 26 years on the force, and a mortgage on a lake house that Brennan's godfather had quietly helped him refinance. He came around the desk, glanced into the holding cell to size up the problem, and stopped. The blood left Doyle's face like water out of a cracked glass. He knew that face. Every commander in Ashford knew that face. It hung on the wall of the Civilian Oversight Commission. It had signed the letter that opened the file currently sitting unread in Doyle's own desk drawer. The man in the holding cell, plain jacket, split lip, cuffs still biting into his wrists, was Julian Reeves, the Inspector General, the single most dangerous human being a corrupt precinct could ever lock in a cage. "Oh, God," Doyle whispered. "Oh, God, no. No, no, no." "Captain Doyle," Reeves said calmly from behind the bars. It was the first time he had spoken since Delancey Street. "You have a decision to make in the next 60 seconds. It will determine whether you retire or whether you go to prison. I would choose very carefully." Doyle fumbled the cell door open with shaking hands. "Sir, Inspector General, there's been a terrible mistake, a horrible mistake. We can fix this. We can make this." "Do not touch these cuffs," Reeves said. Doyle's hands froze in the air. "The cuffs stay on until a neutral officer, on camera, removes them and photographs the marks on my wrists. Do you understand me? You will not clean up this scene. You will preserve it, every piece of it." Yes, sir," Doyle's voice cracked. "Whatever you—" "Now bring me Sergeant Brennan," Reeves said, "and bring me the young officer who tried to stop him." His eyes hardened. "Brennan, you will hold. The young one you will not touch at all. Is that clear?" It was clear. It was the clearest thing that had ever happened to Roy Doyle. Somewhere down the hall, a man with his boots up on a chair was still laughing and had no idea the ground had already opened beneath him. By noon, the machinery Julian Reeves had spent 30 years building began to turn. And it turned against the very department he had sworn to serve. He made 3 phone calls from Captain Doyle's office, with the door standing open and Doyle pressed rigid against the wall. The first was to Naomi Frost, his deputy at the office of the Inspector General. "Naomi," he said, "activate the 8th precinct file. Full seizure. I want the servers, the evidence room, and every dash cam and body cam file from the last 24 months before anyone in this building decides to lose them." He paused. "And, Naomi, I was the subject this morning. I'm a victim and a witness now. Assign my case to the state, not to us. I will not investigate my own attack." That single sentence was why they would never be able to touch him. "I will not investigate my own attack." He gave away the one thing a corrupt man always clings to: control of his own case. He handed it to a neutral authority the moment he could have kept it, and in doing so, he made himself untouchable in the only way that lasts. The second call went to the office of the State Attorney General. The third went to an old friend at the FBI's Civil Rights Division. By 2 o'clock, the small parking lot of the 8th Precinct held vehicles that had never parked there before. State Bureau sedans, plain and gray, 2 federal cars, a forensic van backing slowly up to the evidence room door. Officers who had spent their whole careers being the ones who arrived now stood at their own windows, watching other people arrive for them. The mood inside the building changed the way a room changes when the power cuts out. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A sergeant quietly walked to the break room and turned off a television. 2 officers near the evidence room found urgent reasons to be somewhere else. They could all feel it, even the ones who had done nothing wrong. The specific dread of a place that has always investigated others, discovering what it feels like to be the thing under the light. Naomi Frost walked through the front doors with a sealed court order in her hand, and the calm of a person who had waited a long time for exactly this. She did not raise her voice. She never did. She simply laid the order on the desk, and the desk sergeant read it. And the reading of it was the sound of a fortress unlocking from the inside. Captain Doyle met them at the desk and did not resist. He had already chosen retirement over prison, and he had chosen it in the first 60 seconds, precisely as he'd been told. Sergeant Kyle Brennan was still in the break room when the door opened. He looked up, expecting a dispatcher. It was, though he had no way of knowing it, the last easy breath he would draw as a free man. Instead of a dispatcher, he saw 2 state investigators and his own captain, whose face was the color of wet cement. "Kyle," Doyle said hoarsely, "stand up. Don't say anything. Don't say a single word."
"What is this?"
Brennan stood, a slow grin still hanging on his face, certain this was a mistake that would evaporate the second he made a phone call. "Somebody want to tell me what's going on here?" Naomi Frost stepped forward. "Sergeant Kyle Brennan, you're being detained in connection with the unlawful arrest and assault of Julian Reeves, Inspector General of the Ashford Police Department. This case is now under joint state and federal jurisdiction." She let it settle. "The man you handcuffed this morning oversees the office that investigates you, and he is exceptionally good at his job." The grin came apart slowly, like ice going out of a river in spring. No. That guy was driving a beater. He didn't say anything about being—" Brennan's voice climbed, cracking. "You don't understand. Call Councilman Marsh, Gerald Marsh. He's my godfather. He'll tell you this is a misunderstanding. I've got people. You've got nothing." "Make the call," Frost said. "It won't help you, but make it." They walked him out through the middle of the bullpen, in front of every officer on the shift. He did not go quietly. He shouted the councilman's name like a password to a door that had already been welded shut. He still believed that phone call would save him. It was the last thing he would ever believe. Here is where an ordinary story would end. The bully caught. The cavalry arrived. Roll credits. But this was not an ordinary story. And Kyle Brennan had not been lying about one thing. He really did have people. And his people were about to come. Before they did, Naomi Frost sat the Inspector General down in a borrowed conference room at the State Bureau and opened a folder. "There's something you need to see," she said. "The audit you started 3 weeks ago. The pattern file on the 8th Precinct." She slid it across the table. "Brennan's in it, sir. Not once, 11 times." Reeves went still. "4 of your 5 complainants describe him by name or by badge number," Frost went on. 2 of the dashcam files that went missing were deleted from a terminal logged in under his ID. There's a pattern of stops on the south side, all the same shape. Older black residents. Invented probable cause. A crime written into the report after the fact. She looked up. This morning wasn't a random stop that happened to you. You didn't stumble into a bad cop. You were already hunting this exact one. He just walked up at dawn and put his hands on the hunter. Reeves opened the folder, and there it was. Page 1. A man pulled over for a taillight that worked. Page 2. A teenager cuffed for matching a description that fit half the block. Page 3. A grandmother's car torn apart at midnight because she seemed nervous. Same handwriting, same shape, same lie over and over. A crime that only ever appeared after the stop had already gone wrong. Every page was a small detonation, and everyone had the same badge number stamped in the corner. Then he turned to page 4 and stopped. Gloria Coleman, her son Andre. A burglary 2 miles from where the boy actually was, provable by a time-stamped receipt no one at the precinct had ever bothered to pull. The charge had been dropped after it had already done its work. The scholarship was gone. The complaint had gone into a drawer, and the officer's badge number on the report was the same badge number that had bent Julian Reeves over the hood of a Buick that morning. He closed the folder. He did not smile. To a man like him, vindication was never a pleasure. It was the confirmation of something sad he had already suspected. Then this stopped being about me the moment you opened that file, he said quietly. One assault is a headline. A pattern is a case. He tapped the folder once with a single finger. I want every complaint Brennan ever generated, he said. I want the 5 that were buried. I want to know exactly who signed off on burying them. And I want to know how much of Gerald Marsh's protection over the years was paid for with public money. Frost hesitated. That last part goes very high, sir. Higher than a precinct. Higher than a captain. Good, Reeves said. Then we go very high. The fortress Gerald Marsh had spent a career building had one flaw he had never imagined. It assumed the man at the top of the oversight office could always be managed, or bought, or frightened. It had never once planned for the day that man would be the one bleeding on the hood of the car, and that man was done bleeding now. He was ready to collect. Councilman Gerald Marsh had run Ashford's police budget committee for 16 years. He understood a thing most people never learn. Power is not what you hold, it is who owes you. Over 16 years, he had put 3 captains in their chairs, blocked 2 separate oversight reforms, and watched over his godson, Kyle, since the boy's father died in the line of duty. When Brennan's one phone call reached him, Marsh did what had never once failed him in his life. He started dialing. He called the mayor's chief of staff first. I need this handled internally, he said smoothly, before it turns into a circus. One of our officers, a good family, a misunderstanding at a traffic stop. Let's not feed the activists. He had made this call a dozen times before. It had worked a dozen times. He called Vincent Hoyt, the police union president, and told him to throw the union's full legal weight behind Brennan. Every lawyer we've got, Vince, this is one of ours. Hoyt had built his career on the promise that the union never abandoned an officer. He agreed at once. He called a friendly reporter he had fed 100 stories over the years and floated a gentle one. A routine stop, mischaracterized by people with an agenda. A decent sergeant caught in a political crossfire. He gave the man a quote, off the record, and hung up satisfied. There was a rhythm to all of it, and Marsh knew the rhythm by heart. He had killed a body camera reform this same way 3 years ago, with 3 phone calls and a quiet lunch. He had ended a reporter's beat once, and installed a captain another time, all with the same patient patience. Power, to Gerald Marsh, was a set of levers on a wall. You learned where each one was. You learned how hard to pull, and the machine did the rest while you sat in a leather chair and waited. So he sat in the leather chair. He poured himself 2 fingers of something old, and he waited. And for a while, for a maddening, sickening while, it worked. The morning news ran his version almost word for word. A routine stop, mischaracterized by activists, the anchor said, over a flattering photo of Brennan in his dress uniform. By 10 o'clock, the sergeant had been released after questioning and was out in the daylight again, smug and free. already telling anyone who'd listen that he was the real victim here. The union announced its full and immediate support. A spokesman for the mayor said only that the city was reviewing the facts. Somewhere across town, a young sergeant slept soundly for the first time in days, certain his godfather had fixed it, the way he always fixed it. For about 18 hours, it looked exactly like Gerald Marsh was going to win. He had won this precise fight a dozen times before, with these precise moves. And that was the trap of it, because what Marsh didn't know, what neither of them ever understood, was that the man on the other side of this did not fight the way Marsh fought. He didn't pull levers. He didn't trade favors. He didn't call in old debts. He simply, patiently, removed the wall the levers were bolted to. By the second morning, the ground began to give way. It gave way in the order these things always do. Money first. The mayor's chief of staff stopped taking Marsh's calls by the second evening. It wasn't personal. It was arithmetic. The mayor's own lawyers had gathered in a conference room and watched Renata Ortiz's balcony video on a loop. 2 minutes and 9 seconds. A calm old man slammed onto the hood of his own car by a shouting sergeant. Nobody in the room said a word for a while. Then the senior counsel closed the laptop and said the only thing that mattered. The victim runs oversight. The whole thing is on 2 cameras. If we get anywhere near this man's defense, the number stops being millions and starts being a headline that follows the mayor for the rest of her career. You do not spend political capital shielding the man who assaulted the inspector general on video. You put a hallway between yourself and him, and then you put a second hallway behind the first. The union lever failed next. Vincent Hoyt had already promised Marsh the full weight of the union, and he'd meant it, right up until his lead attorney spread the file across a table and walked him through it page by page. The 2 camera angles, the booking sheet with the wrong middle initial typed on purpose, the 5 old complaints, and, at the center of all of it, the identity of the man in the cuffs. Vince, the lawyer said, listen to me carefully. This is not a case we can win. It is only a case we can lose loudly, in public, with our name on it. If we defend Kyle Brennan, we are not defending a brother officer. We are painting a target on every officer we have. Hoyt felt 16 years of certainty tilt and slide out from under him like a floor giving way. And the friendly reporter never wrote the friendly story. Because someone inside the 8th precinct, no one ever proved who, though Reeves had his guesses, had already handed that reporter the real footage, the body cam video, the booking sheet with the wrong initial typed on purpose. By the time Marsh's version reached the newsroom, the truth was already sitting on the editor's desk. The story that ran the next morning did not use the word misunderstanding. It used the word pattern. Every lever Gerald Marsh pulled came back in his hand, disconnected from the machine, because the machine did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to Julian Reeves. And Reeves did not pull levers to get his way. He removed them, one by one, so that no one would ever pull them again. That night, Gerald Marsh made 41 phone calls. The record of them would later become an exhibit at his own trial. 41 calls, and by the last one, he was no longer asking men to help him. He was asking them to remember that he existed. The party chairman didn't pick up. The deputy mayor's assistant said he was unavailable. An old friend on the bench, a judge Marsh had helped seat, listened for 30 seconds and then said the 4 words that ended their friendship. Don't call me again. One by one, the people who owed Gerald Marsh remembered a debt more pressing than the one they owed him, the debt every powerful person owes to their own survival, and they paid it by cutting him loose. By midnight, the most powerful man in Ashford was sitting alone in a leather chair, holding a phone that had stopped ringing. The betrayal, when it finally came, was quiet and total. It came in the order that betrayals always come, weakest first. Captain Roy Doyle broke within 48 hours. He had spent 26 years learning how to survive inside the department, and survival, in the end, was the only skill he had left. He was facing charges for the false booking record, for years of buried complaints. He was going to lose the lake house and the pension either way. So he sat down across a scarred table from 2 state prosecutors and gave them the whole rotten map. He testified that Brennan's 5 complaints had been buried on Marsh's direct instruction. He handed over emails he'd been careful never to delete, an insurance policy kept for exactly this kind of morning. He described a meeting 3 years back, his voice flat and ashamed. The one where they'd quietly agreed to keep Kyle Brennan on. Brennan was, in Doyle's own words, a liability everybody in that room agreed to keep because of who his godfather was. A prosecutor asked him why he'd gone along with it. Doyle looked at his own hands for a long moment. Because the ones who didn't go along, he said, stopped getting promoted. Then he signed his name to all of it. 26 years of loyalty, traded for a lighter sentence, the instant the walls came close enough to touch. Vincent Hoyt went next. The union president had built his whole identity on never abandoning an officer. But then prosecutors showed him something. 2 of Brennan's earlier victims had been quietly paid off, settlements arranged by Marsh, routed in a way that kept the complaints out of the public record, and partly drawn from the union's own legal fund. In that moment, Hoyt understood he was no longer a defender of officers. He was a co-conspirator in hiding their crimes. He resigned the presidency that week and, through his lawyer, offered to cooperate against the very man he had promised to protect an hour earlier. And finally there was Gerald Marsh himself. Marsh held out longer than the others, because men who have never lost cannot imagine losing. But when the state attorney general subpoenaed 16 years of committee records, the pattern rose up out of the paper like a photograph developing. The blocked reforms. The arranged settlements. The captains installed precisely because they knew how to look away. The mayor cut him loose in a single press conference, choosing the words carefully so that none of the blame could splash back. The party asked for his resignation by the end of the week. And the godfather, who had sworn to a frightened young sergeant that he was protected, never once visited him in custody. Not a call, not a letter. Nothing. Everyone who had shielded Kyle Brennan abandoned him the exact second their own freedom landed on the table. The brotherhood he had bragged about turned out to be a room full of people, all of them quietly deciding who would run first. They all ran, and Brennan was left standing alone in the middle of the room he thought he owned. Most stories would have ended there, 3 men falling, one after another. But Julian Reeves had spent 30 years learning a hard rule of his trade. When a man is willing to bury 5 files, it is almost never only 5. Cover-ups are like roaches. If you can see a few in the light, there are more in the dark. So he told Naomi Frost to keep digging. Not the drawer, underneath the drawer. It took 9 days. And what Frost carried into his office on the 9th day was not a complaint. Complaints go in a drawer. This one had never made it that far. It had been erased before it could become a piece of paper. There's a death, she said. She did not sit down. 2 years ago, it never became a case because the family was told the wrong thing, and the one officer who tried to flag it got transferred out of state within a week. Reeves set down his pen. Tell me. His name was Elias Warren, 59 years old, a mechanic who had fixed the city school buses for 22 years. He was a diabetic, and on a cold night in March, his blood sugar had cratered while he was driving home. His car drifted, his speech slurred. To anyone trained to see it, it was a medical emergency. To Sergeant Kyle Brennan, it was a drunk man being difficult. Brennan pulled him out of the car. Warren tried to say he was sick, that he needed sugar, that his kit was in the glove box. Brennan heard defiance. He always heard defiance. He cuffed him, booked him for driving under the influence, and put him in a holding cell to sleep it off. Warren told them he was dying. He told the jailer through the bars. He asked for his medicine 4 times. It is in the log, in his own failing words, transcribed by a bored night shift officer who wrote the word uncooperative beside a man's cry for help. By morning, Elias Warren was gone, a diabetic coma, in a concrete room, 40 feet from a first aid kit. The report said, found unresponsive, cause undetermined. His daughter was told her father's heart had simply given out. And the young jailer, who had begged his supervisor to call an ambulance and been told to mind his post, was quietly transferred to a department 3 states away before he could say a word to anyone. The room was silent for a long moment. He didn't just make people disappear from their own lives, Frost said quietly. One of them he made disappear from the earth, and the same machine that buried 5 complaints buried a body under a false cause of death.
Reeves stood and walked to the window. He was not a man who showed much, but his hands, folded behind his back, were pressed white at the knuckles. He had come to Delancey Street that morning because a hum in his chest told him this neighborhood was bleeding somewhere he couldn't see. He had been right. He just hadn't known how deep the wound went.
The morning he handcuffed me, Reeves said slowly, I thought that was the worst thing this man had done. His whole career, built on treating people like they were disposable. He turned from the window. It wasn't even close to his biggest mistake. It was just the first one that happened to a man who could pull the thread, because that was the terrible arithmetic of it. If Brennan had picked anyone else that Saturday, Elias Warren would still be a heart attack in a family's memory. The scholarship boy would still be a nobody with a record. 5 silenced people would have stayed silent, and a grave would have kept its lie. The wrongful arrest of the Inspector General was not the crime. It was the crack. The one accident that let the light into a place that had been sealed for 2 years. Reeves went to see Elias Warren's daughter himself. Her name was Danielle, and she had spent 2 years quietly certain that something about her father's death was wrong, and quietly certain that no one would ever tell her the truth. He sat in her living room and told her the truth, all of it. She did not scream. She pressed a hand to her mouth and rocked, very slightly, the way people do when a weight they have carried alone is finally set down by someone else's hands.
They told me his heart gave out, she whispered.
His heart was fine, Reeves said gently. The men who were supposed to protect him were not.
He did not promise her comfort. There is no comfort for a thing like that. He promised her something a man in his position could actually deliver. He promised her the record. He promised her that the world would know exactly what happened to Elias Warren and exactly who let it, and that it would be written down when no one could ever bury it again.
Then he drove back to the city, and he called the federal prosecutors, and he told them the charges had just changed. This was no longer a case about a wrongful arrest. It was a case about a death. The interview room at the State Bureau was small and gray, and it had no clock. That was deliberate. Kyle Brennan had been in custody for 6 days. The sharply pressed uniform was gone now, replaced by a jail jumpsuit that made him look, for the first time in his life, entirely ordinary. Across the steel table sat 2 people, Naomi Frost with a thick folder, and Julian Reeves, present not as a victim, but as the Inspector General, because the law allowed it, and because he needed Brennan to hear it from the man himself. Reeves said nothing at first. He simply set a photograph on the table, a split lip, a wrist ringed with a deep purple bruise from a cuff ratcheted down too tight on purpose.
You told me nobody was coming for me,
Reeves said quietly. You were half right, Sergeant. Nobody came for me. I didn't need them to.
He slid a second document across the steel.
This is the audit I opened into your precinct 3 weeks before you ever touched me. Your name appears in it 11 times. You didn't arrest a stranger that morning. You attacked the investigation that was already closing around you, and you did it in front of 2 cameras.
Brennan's jaw worked. He reached for the only script he had ever needed. It was a mistake. It was early. The block had break-ins. I made a judgment call.
You said a man like me doesn't drive a car like that, Reeves cut in, and his voice still did not rise. You looked at my old jacket and my old car, and you decided a man like me couldn't own either one. You decided no one would ever believe him over you. That was not a judgment call, Sergeant. That was the whole method, and it is the exact same method in every one of these 5 buried files. You did to me precisely what you did to them. The only difference is that this time, the man bent over the hood of the car happened to run the office that keeps the file.
Marsh will, Brennan started.
Gerald Marsh resigned yesterday morning, Frost said. She pressed play on a small recorder. The councilman's voice filled the little gray room, thin and hurried, recorded from his own cooperation interview.
The Brennan boy was always trouble. I protected him for his father's sake, but he did this to himself. I want it on the record that I told Hoyt years ago to rein the kid in.
Frost pressed stop. The last light in Kyle Brennan's world, quietly, went out.
The godfather, who had promised him he was protected, had just, in his own recorded words, thrown him to the wolves, to save his own skin. Brennan stared at the recorder with his mouth open, and something behind his eyes finally understood that there was no phone call left in the world for him to make.
"They all traded you," Reeves said. There was no cruelty in it, only the heavy, level finality of a man reading out a verdict. Your captain, your union, your godfather. Every single person you thought made you strong was only ever using you. And every one of them let go the instant it cost them anything at all. That is what a man finds at the bottom of the hole he dug for himself. That he dug it alone.
Brennan put his face in his cuffed hands. He did not shout. He wept. For his career. For his freedom. For the version of himself that had felt so enormous at dawn on Delancey Street. In a cracked voice, he asked for a deal.
"That's not my office," Reeves said, rising to his feet. "I only investigate. Other people decide." He gathered the photograph and the folder. "But I'll tell you what I told your captain. Choose carefully. It's the last real choice you have left." He walked out without looking back. 4 months later, the granite steps of the Ashford County Courthouse were crowded with cameras. But the cameras were not the only ones on the steps. Word had traveled through the South Side, and the people who had spent years being told they were nobody had come to watch the morning that word stopped being true. Gloria Coleman stood near the front, her son Andre beside her. Others were there too, faces from complaints that had died in drawers. People who had learned to expect nothing at all from this building. They did not chant. They did not need to. They simply stood and let themselves be seen. And that was its own kind of verdict. Julian Reeves climbed them without hurry, in a plain dark suit. The split lip long healed. The bruise on his wrist faded to nothing. Naomi Frost walked beside him. He had declined every request for a triumphant statement. He was not there to be seen. He was there because the law he had served for 30 years was about to do, in public and on the record, the exact thing he had spent his whole career trying to make it do. Kyle Brennan pleaded guilty to unlawful arrest, assault under color of law, falsifying an official record, and deprivation of civil rights. The plea spared the city a trial. It did not spare Brennan the one thing he had spent his whole career avoiding, being seen clearly, in the light, by a room full of people who knew exactly what he was. Before the sentence came down, the judge did something he was not required to do. He recognized the victim's right to speak, and Julian Reeves rose. He did not walk to the podium. He stood at his place, squared his shoulders, and turned to face Kyle Brennan directly. Brennan tried to look down at the table, but the quiet weight of the man he had bent over a car hood compelled him somehow to look up. "For 30 years, Reeves began, and the courtroom went completely still. "My job has been to hold this department to the oath it swears. I have investigated hundreds of officers. Most of them were good people who made a bad call on a hard night. A few were not. And in all that time, I never once expected to end up as an item in my own files." He let the silence stretch. "You did not stop me that morning because you feared for your safety, Sergeant. You stopped me because you saw an older black man in an old coat standing next to an old car, and you decided that man was small enough to step on. You were so certain no one would believe him over you that you invented the crime before you ever asked his name." Brennan flinched. "I want to be precise about what you took," Reeves went on, his voice never rising above a level, carrying calm. "You did not only take a morning from me. You took 2 years from Andre Coleman, whose scholarship died in a file in this precinct's drawer. You took the sleep of 5 families who filed complaints and were taught patiently that they were nobody. That is what your badge became in your hands. Not a shield for the public, a license to make people disappear from their own lives. And the men who sat next to you," he turned briefly toward the 2 hollowed figures at the second table, "did not stop you. They sold that license, wholesale, for 16 years and called it order." He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I do not ask the court to punish these men for what they did to me. I asked from the first hour that my case be handled by a neutral authority, precisely so that this moment could never be about my anger. I asked the court to sentence them for the people who could not stand where I am standing, for the ones who were told their voices did not count. Let this be the record that says finally in this city that no badge is heavier than the law it was sworn to serve.
He sat down. The silence in the room was absolute.
The judge, citing the pattern the audit had dragged into the light, sentenced Kyle Brennan to 19 years in state prison. Brennan wept into his hands as the number landed, all of his largeness finally gone. Captain Roy Doyle, who had cooperated, drew 4 years and lost the pension he had spent 26 years protecting. The lake house sold to pay his lawyers. Vincent Hoyt lost the union he had ruled and received a 5-year term for his role in the arranged settlements. And Gerald Marsh, the man who ran Ashford for 16 years and never once lost, was convicted of obstruction and misuse of public funds and sentenced to 6 years. His committee was dissolved. His name was pried off the front of the community center it had adorned for a decade. But the arrest case was never the whole of it. The death of Elias Warren was its own reckoning, and it climbed higher than all the rest. The audit had traced the sealed autopsy and the overnight transfer of the one honest jailer back to a single signature. It belonged to Deputy Chief Raymond Sloan, the man who had spent a decade making inconvenient things disappear, so the numbers on the chief's desk always came out clean. Sloan had buried Warren's death in 48 hours, ruled it natural, shipped the only witness 3 states away before the body was even called. He was convicted of obstruction, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations resulting in death, and sentenced to 22 years, the longest term handed down in the entire case. And Kyle Brennan, already facing 19 years for the pattern, would now stand trial a second time for the death itself. The man who had looked at a dying diabetic and seen a drunk being difficult was going to answer for a life. Not just a lie, but the number that mattered most to Julian Reeves was not a sentence. It was a settlement. The city of Ashford established an $8.5 million fund for the victims of the 8th Precinct. The 5 whose complaints had been buried and the others the audit had since pulled out of the dark. Their records were cleared. Their voices, silenced for years, were finally entered into the permanent record of the city, and Reeves declined his own portion, every dollar. He directed the full amount owed to him into that fund instead. He had not done any of this to be paid. He had done it because a badge is a public trust, and he had spent his entire life collecting on that trust when other men broke it. There was one piece of business the machinery of justice too often forgets: the people who were hurt before the cameras were ever watching. Among the 5 buried files was one belonging to a woman named Gloria Coleman. 2 years earlier, her son Andre had been stopped by Brennan 3 blocks from their home, accused of a burglary he could not have committed, and booked on a charge that quietly disappeared only after it had cost the boy a college scholarship. Mrs. Coleman had filed a complaint. The complaint had gone into a drawer. She had spent 2 years being told in 100 small ways that she was nobody. Julian Reeves went to see her himself. He sat at her kitchen table. He told her Andre's record was cleared. He told her that her complaint was now part of the case that had put 3 men in prison, and that the city owed her family a debt it was finally going to pay. Mrs. Coleman cried at her own table, not from grief this time, from the strange, overdue weight of finally being believed. "Why you?" she asked him. "Why did it take them doing it to you?" "Because they picked the wrong person to do it to," Reeves said gently. "But you were always the right person to fight for. It just took the world a while to see it." And there was one more thing. On a quiet afternoon, in a small ceremony with no cameras, Julian Reeves shook the hand of a young man in a crisp uniform. Officer Danny Vega had testified without flinching. His body camera footage had been the spine of the entire case. His fellow officers had called him a rat. Brennan's friends had made his life on the job miserable. He had done the right thing anyway, on a morning when the easy thing was to see nothing at all. "They told you your career was over," Reeves said. "Yes, sir," Vega answered. "For about a week, I believed them." "My office is building a new unit," Reeves said. "Officers who investigate officers. It is the hardest, loneliest job in this entire department because it asks you to choose the truth over your own side. Most people can't do it." He held out a folder. "You already made that choice once. at dawn, with a camera nobody asked you to turn on. I'd like you to make it for a living.
Vega took the folder in both hands.
From the wreckage of one bad morning, a good officer had found a purpose. The same reckoning that ended one man's career had opened another's. The scales, so violently tipped over on Delancey Street, had finally come to rest exactly level.
As Reeves walked down the courthouse steps into the autumn light, a reporter shouted one last question. "Inspector General, the man who arrested you called you a nobody. Any response?"
Reeves paused. He thought about the hood of the car, cold against his cheek. He thought about 5 complaints waiting years in a drawer. He thought about a young officer's shaking hand finding the record button. He was right. Reeves said, "That morning I was nobody, just a man buying a pipe fitting, asking an officer for his name. And that is exactly the point. The law has to protect the nobody, or it protects no one at all. I just happened to be the nobody who could make sure it did."
He got into his old Buick, the same 12-year-old car, and drove himself home. No motorcade, no security detail, just a man who had never needed to be large in order to be powerful. Because real power was never in the badge, or the connections, or the Godfather's phone. It was in the quiet, unbreakable willingness to hold the line when every person around you expects you to bend. Sergeant Kyle Brennan had gone looking for someone small to make himself feel big. And he had found the one man in the entire city who understood that true authority never has to raise its voice. It only has to keep the receipts. Stories like this one are easy to enjoy for the wrong reason. It feels good to watch a cruel man fall. It feels good to see the powerful stripped of their protection, to hear the gavel come down, to watch a machine that crushed the weak get torn apart in the daylight, on live television, in front of the whole city it once terrified. That satisfaction is real, and there is nothing wrong with feeling it, but it is not the lesson. If all you carry away from Julian Reeves is the pleasure of watching Kyle Brennan weep, you have taken the smallest thing this story has to give. Here is the larger thing. Every person Brennan destroyed, he destroyed the same way. He looked at a coat, he looked at a car, he looked at the color of a face, and in half a second, without knowing one true thing about the human being in front of him, he decided that person was small, disposable, a story he could tell however he wanted, because no one would ever believe them over him. That is the engine underneath every cruelty in this story. Not hatred exactly, something quieter and far more common. The habit of deciding who matters based on what they appear to be worth. And the thing that finally broke that engine was not a bigger gun. It was not a louder voice. It was a 54-year-old man in a faded jacket who simply refused to perform the fear he was expected to perform, who stayed calm when calm was the hardest thing in the world to be, who understood that you do not have to be the loudest person in the room to be the most powerful one. You only have to be the one who keeps the receipts. There is a lesson in that, and you can carry it out of this story into a life that will never once involve a corrupt precinct. The lesson is this: you do not know who anyone is. The tired man at the hardware store, the woman running your paperwork at a desk, the quiet person you were about to speak down to because their shoes were worn, or their car was old, or their name was hard to say. You do not know. You never really know, and the moment you decide that you do, the moment you let an appearance tell you a person's worth, you have made the exact mistake that ended Kyle Brennan. Only smaller, and without the cameras to catch it. So treat the nobody like they might be the most important person you will ever meet. Not because they might turn out to be an inspector general, but because that was never the point. The point, the thing Reeves said on the courthouse steps with the whole city listening, is that it should never take a title to earn basic decency. The law has to protect the nobody, or it protects no one. And a person has to respect the nobody, or their respect was never worth very much to begin with. There is a second lesson, quieter than the first. When you are the one being crushed, when someone with more power has decided you are small and there is nothing you can do about it, remember what Reeves did. He did not scream, he did not beg, he did not hand them the panic they were feeding on. He kept his composure, he kept the record, and he waited. Because arrogance is patient, but it is never careful. Given enough time, a cruel man will always overreach. He will bury one file too many. He will pick one victim who can pull the thread. And the quiet person who kept their dignity and their evidence will still be standing there, calm as morning, when the loud man's entire world finally comes apart. Composure is not weakness. It is the long game. And the long game almost always wins. Julian Reeves drove home in the same 12-year-old car he had been arrested beside. No motorcade, no fanfare. Just a man who had proven, one more time, that the truest power in the world has never once needed to raise its voice. It only needs to refuse to bend, refuse to lie, and refuse, no matter what it costs, to look away from the people everyone else decided did not count. Elias Warren got his name back. Danielle got the truth. Andre got his record cleared and his future handed back to him. A young officer named Danny Vega found out exactly what his own courage was worth. And a grave in a quiet cemetery finally stopped keeping someone else's lie. That is what happens when one man refuses to look away. That is what a nobody can do. If this story of quiet strength and hard-earned justice hit you the way it hit us, do us one favor. Hit that like button to support stories where the truth wins. Share it with someone who believes accountability should apply to everyone, badge or no badge. And subscribe for more real stories where arrogance finally meets the one thing it can never bully, the law. One question before you go. Brennan got 19 years, but the godfather who protected him for 16 years got only 6. Was that justice, or did the man who pulled the strings get off too easy? Tell us in the comments. We read them, and we'll see you in the next one.